All right, so it's 12:19. I think we can get started. So hello, everybody. Once again, my name is Julia Scott. I'm a DEI coordinator at the School of Social Work's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And I want to welcome you all to today's event, Unpacking Anti-Semitism. This is a joint effort between our office, the DEI office, and the DEIC, which is our organization that focuses on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So make sure you all are relaxed and ready to have a hopefully awesome conversation. We have some really awesome people on our panel today. And so before we get started, we usually start with some community agreements. I want to make sure we go over all of that. These are our community agreements for today. I'm going to allow folks to kind of just sit with them for a bit. We want to make sure that during the process of our conversation, people are, of course, respecting each other and understanding how we want to show up in this space, even if it's virtual. So take some time to look at these before we get started with our panel. Okay. And I want to let everyone know, so we are going to have a panel discussion that's going to be moderated, and then there will be time for questions towards the end. I will make sure to be looking at the chat. So if you have any questions, you can please place them there, and I'll make sure to try to get those during the conversation. So thank you for that. And I'm going to actually pass it off to Samantha Fuld, who is going to be our moderator for today's panel. So Samantha, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Julia, and welcome everyone. I'm Samantha Fuld. I'm clinical faculty at the School of Social Work, and I'm also co-chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee here at the School of Social Work. I'm so excited to be here with all of you today, talking about how we both unpack and understand anti-Semitism in our communities, and also hopefully to get to some ways in which we as a social work community or a social work connected community can work to address, undo, and dismantle anti-Semitism that's certainly been rising, as have many forms of hate right now in our society. So we have several amazing panelists here with us today. And to start us off, I'd just love to give each panelist the opportunity to introduce yourself, and as you do, to also share a little bit in whatever way you're comfortable about who you are and how you would describe your Jewish identity. So to start off, Judith, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, let me come off mute. So I'm Judith Shagrin. I am a graduate of the School of Social Work a very long time ago. And I am a sort of retired public child welfare wonk who's still working in public child welfare. I just can't believe it. So what I would say is that I am a proud social worker and a loud and proud Jew. That being Jewish is who I am. It's a core part of my identity, and the values, it's hard to talk on, I want to use my hands. A core part of my identity has to do with the values like Tikkun Olam, repair the world, tzedakah, our obligation to care for others, chesed, which is caring and having a caring community, welcoming the stranger. So those are all values by which I lead my life, and they define who I am, and were a really important part of the driver of becoming a social worker, which is a career that I found to be very compatible with my Jewish beliefs and ideals. So I came in, so I also teach at the School of Social Work, clinical child welfare, if anybody's interested. And finally, I guess I just say, I'm really glad to be here today that for a long time I've had concerns, shall I say. And so I'm really delighted that the DEI office listened to those concerns and have responded. All right.
Thanks so much, Judith. Sean, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Good afternoon, y'all. I'm Sean. I am from Chicago, Illinois. I am an American descendant of slavery is my ethnic identity. Identify as just Jewish. My congregation that I'm an official member of is Bowden Street. However, I do attend Rabbi Burg's Saturday service, right? So I'm here to just see what I can do. I am an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, as well as the founder of the Hip Hop Party for Change, which intends to teach voting political education to youth. Thank you for letting me share space.
Thanks so much, Sean. Rabbi Burg, you got a shout out there, so why don't you introduce yourself next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Burg. I'm the senior rabbi of Beth Synagogue in Reservoir Hill, which is in central West Baltimore, near Druid Hill Park. Sean and I, the Yiddish word is we're Landsmen. We're both Chicagoans. Though it's been a while since we talked about, like, I imagine we're both behind, get behind the Bulls and the Bears, but are you Cubs or Sox? I don't remember if we had that discussion.
Cubs only over here, sir. All
right, excellent. We're still good. So go Cubbies. So this year they're showing up just like our O's, right? So how do I identify? In some ways my Jewishness is my vocation, so it's hard to kind of divorce my Jewish identity from my daily life in so many ways. But I was raised in the Reform movement. I'm a conservative rabbi of a previously and for many years unaffiliated synagogue. So I would say that I draw from different ways of Jewish walking in the world and see myself, my life, animated by my Jewish values, by my connection to God as I understand God, and by a call toward helping to create a more just society.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rabbi Burg. Jessica, you're next up on my screen.
Cool. Hi, my name is Jessica Libowitz. I am a graduate student in the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. I identify as a queer humanistic Jew. So for me, my Jewishness personally is sort of revolving around ethnicity and heritage and culture, as well as the choice to show up for other people. And yeah, I work in education equity and with students in Baltimore City.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jessica. And Maria.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Slade. I'm the Assistant Education Director for the Anti-Defamation League's Washington, D.C. office. The D.C. office serves communities in D.C., Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. My Jewish identity is something that's kind of a little fluid and constantly changing. I grew up in rural Appalachia, where my family and I were the only Jews in a very small town. And I went to Jewish summer camp every summer and have worked exclusively in Jewish nonprofit organizations for my entire career. I'm really passionate about helping to create inclusive Jewish communities, and fighting anti-Semitism is a huge part of making that happen. Excited to be here with you all today.
Wonderful. And Corey.
Hi, I'm Corey Shdaimah. I am a professor here at the School of Social Work, and so much of what each one of you said resonated with me a little bit, and probably like each of you, it's so hard to figure out which parts of even my Jewish identity to bring forward in this conversation. So I do really want to thank Julia for putting this panel together, and Jennifer Kelman and the DEIC group that puts these panels on, because like Judith, I've been feeling that it would be nice if there was a space to talk about Jewish identity and to talk about anti-Semitism at the school. And so very much appreciate that and being here with all of you. So I identify as a secular humanist Jew, and am very involved with our secular humanist Jewish congregation where I live, which is in the Philadelphia area. I taught there for 16 years, in addition to teaching at the School of Social Work. That's where my kids were raised. And they were also involved with with the socialist Jewish camping movement, the Habonim Dror camping movement, which has been a big part of our identity as a family. Maybe most important to bring forth on, for the School of Social Work, I'm also the Daniel Thursz Distinguished Professor of Social Justice. And when I was inducted in that role about 3 years ago, it was very important to me to look up a little bit about Daniel Thursz's history. So I was even more honored to be put in that role because he drew very much his understanding of social justice as it pertained to being an active Jewish person in the world and just in general from his Jewish values. And so my role at the School of Social Work and thinking about social justice and all of the social justice activities, I think about how my own Jewish identity imbues that role, and I'm really proud that it imbued Daniel Thurz's activism in the community for many years. And I would just say like maybe three main things when I think about Jewish values, or my own Jewish, I ethnically, culturally identification is this weird combination of precarity, right? Feeling always like my existence and my tolerance here is, it's okay, but it's really precarious. And that is just the sense that I live with, but with deep hope, because there have always been people who have supported Jewish people when they have faced oppression, and the way that Jews have supported each other. And then a sense of connection that I maybe hope to emanate. I don't know if other people feel that sense of connection, but a deep sense of connection for other groups and other peoples who might be feeling those similar feelings, whether they talk about them or not.
Thank you so much, Corey, and to all of our panelists for really sharing these pieces of yourself with us today. And Corey, you talked a little bit about connection, and I think that really resonates for me. I'm not sure how it's happening over Zoom, but I'm feeling a sense of connection just in being here all and sharing this space and coming together on this topic. So I hope that maybe y'all are feeling that as well, but also that, we have a series of these panel conversations about how we dismantle different types of oppression and discrimination in our communities, and it really is all interconnected. And so that's certainly something that we'll unpack together today. We're going to start diving a little more deeply into these questions. And before we do, I just want to name, we have this shared community and shared space. And also, for many people here, there are likely going to be topics or experiences brought up that may be activating or triggering. This runs deep. And so first of all, to just take care of yourselves, for all of our panelists to know that you are always welcome to share whatever you're comfortable with and not share at any point. But also that I expect that we're going to have different perspectives amongst ourselves as panelists, amongst those of you who are joining us today. And I hope that we can create a space where this really is a dialogue, a space to listen, a space to hear, and to know what's going to happen and to be okay, to kind of, sometimes we talk about it as expecting and accepting non-closure. And so just want to put it out there that may happen today, that's okay. And this is what I hope is the first of many conversations in an ongoing dialogue that can continue here together. So as we dive in, I'd love to talk just a little bit more to start us off about anti-Semitism and what it is. So the question to the panelists is, how do you define and understand anti-Semitism? And if you're comfortable sharing, what are some ways that it's shown up in your life and how has that impacted you? And I'll give a minute to process.
I'm happy to start by sharing ADL's perspective. ADL's definition of anti-Semitism is that it is the marginalization and or oppression of people who are Jewish. That anti-Semitism is based on stereotypes and myths that target Jews as a people, their religious practices and beliefs, and the Jewish state of Israel. And we always note that definitions are very fraught. that no definition is ever going to feel comprehensive or adequately account for every manifestation of anti-Semitism. And that's because it's a phenomenon that's constantly morphing and adapting itself to different social, political, religious contexts. So definitions can be really helpful as guidelines, but not viewed as the comprehensive. And in my own experience, I think what's shown up most for me have been sort of microaggressions. A lot of "you don't look Jewish," even something a little more explicit that took place when I was in college by a close friend who asked if I got an award at Jew camp for having the smallest nose. So things can be really implicit and also very explicit in terms of those microaggressions.
Yeah, I think building off of that, I think that anti-Semitism really is an insidious form of hate. I think it can be really big, but it also can be really small. It can be easy to recognize and it can be harder to recognize. It can be everything from swastikas on doors and people chanting "Die Jews" to just sort of the erasure of an identity and not acknowledging that it's an identity that exists. So I guess similarly, I think what I face the most would be microaggressions as well, personally. And I think just the assumption that I am Christian, or that people who if you just like in your interactions with other people, if your base assumption is that they're celebrating the same holidays as you, they're holding the same beliefs as you, and that's how you approach the starts of conversations, that's how you approach deadlines and scheduling meetings and things like that. That's what I found can be the most day-to-day harmful, even if it's not as like large and even potentially like obvious violence.
So I'll build on that I believe that somewhat like institutional racism, there is implicit bias buried deep in people's psyches. And just like we are, I consider myself a recovering racist. I need to think about, be thoughtful. I think there's anti-Semitism, Jew discomfort that is within people's psyche, and it becomes an easy go-to in times of trouble. On the far right, it's out there loud and proud. On the progressive left, it's a little bit more insidious. And I too have had I never get I don't look Jewish once they see my hair. But when my daughter graduated from the School of Social Work a couple years ago, she came home. She had someone look at her resume, came home and said, he thought I should take off this, and this from my resume. And I looked at it and I said, well, why? He said, oh, they're not current. Well, one of them was a year ago. What did these things have in common? They identified her on her resume as a Jew, that she'd been to Israel, that she was president of Hillel. And so what he was recommending she do is erase her identity. And needless to say, she did not do that. But when I've told other people about that incident, I understand it's happened to them as well and at other schools. So yeah, I think Jessica's right. Sometimes it's very obvious, and other times anti-Semitism is lurking beneath the surface.
So I'll offer my definition, which is not as sort of sophisticated as the ADL definition. 5 words. It's their fault, not ours. And of course, there's nuance within that. And Jews are not the only group that has been scapegoated throughout history. But I think that at its core, that's really what anti-Semitism is. It is the attempt to assign blame to our people when other people, either individually or as a group, are unwilling to contend with the complexity of how society functions. I'll give maybe just a couple of examples of how I think this manifests. One, a personal example, and another from a book that I think is important. The personal example is from my own daughter, who just this week was performing at a collaborative Shakespeare festival. She's a student at Baltimore School for the Arts, and they were doing Shakespearean scenes. And one of the other schools that was invited to this did a number of scenes from The Merchant of Venice. And those scenes were laced, this was a middle school, and those scenes were laced with anti-Semitic tropes. And the presentation was introduced by saying, we're doing scenes from The Merchant of Venice because it's about racism and revenge. So, you know, there are books and plays that are about racism. Merchant of Venice probably wouldn't come to the top of my list, but there was no mention of anti-Semitism, nor was there any real preparation of the students or the audience as to how that particular play draws on particular anti-Semitic tropes to make its point, right? So that's one. The other is a book that I would kind of commend to people by Dara Horn called People Love Dead Jews. Anyone read that yet? All right, so it's a really, I think it's a really important read. And what animates the book in terms of kind of understanding what this may be about is she was asked to write a piece for Smithsonian Magazine about Anne Frank. And she found herself thinking, I really don't want to do this. Why? And what is it within me that really doesn't want to write about Anne Frank? I mean, everybody loves Anne Frank, right? One of the most widely read books in the entire world. And she did some looking into it, and she discovered two really interesting stories about the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. One of them was there was an employee who years ago was told by the Anne Frank house that he may not wear his yarmulke, right? He may not yet wear his head covering, his Jewish head covering, to work. And when he challenged that, they explained to him that they had a rule against sort of any kind of sort of outward religious clothing. And he challenged that, and the Board of Governors of the museum deliberated for several months, and they finally came back to him and said he was permitted to wear a kippah to work. But Dara Horn asked this question: what would, of all places, what would cause the Anne Frank house to force a Jew into hiding? What is that about, right? And the other is that when you go into the museum, there are places that you can push a little button to get different languages. And so, if you wanted English, there was a British flag. If you wanted German, there was a German flag. If you wanted Hebrew, there was no Israeli flag. And when this was questioned, the answer was, well, we didn't want it to be a political statement, as if the only nation in the world that actively speaks Hebrew as its language needs to be left off. And somehow that is a political statement in order to simply align a language with its. So those are a couple examples that come to mind for me.
The fellow panelists have given a wonderful definition of anti-Semitism in my view. I think that anti-Semitism looks different for different people, though. For me, oftentimes when I speak, I tell people when they ask, I tell them that I was born Jewish, but I didn't know it until I converted. And while people may marvel at that statement and find the beauty in it, it came from a place of pain. One day I was walking down the street. I actively wear a tzitzit. I have kippah and I have my payas, and I was walking my dog, and a gentleman stopped me. He's driving down the street. He pulled over, stopped me, and he asked me, was I Jewish? My only assumption is that he considered that I couldn't be Jewish because I was Black, or maybe something else. But either way, he was telling me that I wasn't Jewish enough for his definition of what Judaism is supposed to look like. So in that moment, right, Baruch Hashem, right, praise God, I had the words to say to him that I was born Jewish. However, I did not know it until I converted. And it was my Jewish journey was even not as particular as people may think it. I didn't just walk into a shul one day and say, hey, I would like to be Jewish and how can I be a part of this tribe? I learned my Judaism from people on the street that have been who teach a lens of Judaism that is needed for Black people who have suffered depression, but is also oppressive in the sense that it does not consider the mixed multitude. I learned my Judaism from the Hebrew Israelites. And it wasn't until I realized that when we started speaking, when we were supposed to be speaking about the mixed multitude, that the multitude wasn't mixed. But I've had that same experience in Jewish spaces where the people ain't Black and they saying that some people don't belong to this multitude that is mixed. So that's my take.
I'm going to add something. I think in addition to, and I just want to point in the chat what Dana wrote in the chat, which Sean, what you're saying is really powerful to hear from you, the idea of like what happens among Jewish people who are deciding who is Jewish enough, what does that look like? So I wanted to draw attention to what you wrote, Dana, so thank you. In addition to feeling similar, especially in progressive spaces where I'm not sure whether it is appropriate for me to talk about my experience as a Jewish person or whether it would be welcome, which are two different questions. I've also thought that anti-Semitism showed up in my life in a place where I didn't used to think it was. So I grew up in a primarily Jewish neighborhood, right? I mean, my public school was closed on the Jewish holidays. And in my life, I often sort of chafed at what I viewed as a very small, relatively homogeneous community. And I have often, much of my adult life, I've pursued interactions with a wider variety of people than I grew up with. It's always been part of what I'm interested in. But I have later come to understand that my whole growing up was actually shaped by anti-Semitism, because the community that I lived in was the community where my parents or my grandparents were able to buy a home and able to practice their religion in America. And so I think that that's something that is not the case so much anymore, although still is the case in some places, not in the places that I live. And I don't think I understood how much that shaped the experience of the generation that made it so that I didn't have to experience that. But it very much shaped my growing up. And when I talk about precarity, I think it also very much shaped my own sense of, where I sit in the world, which may not be obvious from the outside. And so I think that's a kind of an insidious form of anti-Semitism. It's there historically. It still, I don't want to say it's not existing in present, but maybe showing up in different ways. But I think it very much informed my growing up in the environment that I grew up on and the way that my parents, my grandparents' generation tried to protect me from things that they had experienced.
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Maria, I think you had unmuted before. Was there anything you wanted to jump in with?
No, just what I ended up putting in the chat, that the narrative of anti-Semitism is often seen only through the lens of the mainstream white and Ashkenazi narrative, but anti-Semitism impacts all communities. And as several other panelists have mentioned, like Jewish identity is multifaceted. There are Jews of color, Jewish women, what I put in the chat, right? So we need to really be intentional about examining anti-Semitism through this lens of intersectionality.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to acknowledge the rich discussion that's happening in the chat. And, please know we're seeing all of it. We're going to come back to a lot of this. And I think so many of the themes that y'all are talking about in terms of the issue of the intersection of Judaism and whiteness and racism in that, and the impact of the question even of is someone who appears white and Jewish actually white, or is Judaism a race, and how is that defined, right? These are complicated questions. Dana, the question that you brought up of, or the issue that you brought up of anti-Semitism, both externally towards the Jewish community, but also dynamics of it internally within the Jewish community. And I think it's true. I've seen people posting. I don't know that we'll be able to unpack all of it today, but I certainly hope that we can touch on all those themes as we're continuing our conversation. The next place I was hoping that we could touch on a little bit is the fact that all of these discussions that we're having, amongst the panelists and in the chat, all of it is rooted in a long history, a centuries-long history, and a deep historical context. And so, Rabbi Burg, in your sort of role, at your professional role, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that historical context, and any of the other panelists also, of course, feel free to jump in.
Sure, Samantha, I can start. I'm a pulpit rabbi. I'm not a scholar, so feel free, those who are scholars, to also add to, complement, or certainly correct if there's anything that I misstate. Yeah, I think I'll start by building on Corey's comments about her family and her family heritage. I live on Utah Place, which it was the dividing line between white Jewish and Black not Jewish Baltimore for a long time in terms of where folks could live. And if you haven't read the book Not in My Neighborhood, I think it's a really important book in understanding the both the racism and the racist policies that undergird housing policies in Baltimore, but also anti-Semitism and how that manifests as well. And I also put a link to an article by a guy named Eric K. Ward, who speaks to, I think, really convincingly the relationship between anti-Semitism and white nationalism, that particular form of anti-Black racism as well. So in terms of the history of anti-Semitism, it's been called the longest hatred. I'm not sure that the oppression Olympics are ever all that helpful, right? There are other hatreds that may be as ancient, but I think we can accurately say that anti-Semitism is definitely a very long hatred. It's an ancient hatred. It is not new. It's been around for a long time. And as you've already begun to detect, it is sort of a shapeshifter, right? It can take new forms based on the conditions. So a claim of anti-Semitism might be that Jews have all the power, or that Jews have all the information, or that Jews have all the money, right? But equally powerful and insidious is the claim that Jews are dirty, right? That Jews are sort of less sophisticated in certain ways. That was certainly a claim that Hitler made as they tried to justify the Shoah. So it can change. When did it begin? No one exactly knows. It's certainly thousands of years old. And the most compelling book on this I've read is Jacob Nuremberg's Anti-Judaism, which is a tome, right? But if you feel like curling up with a 1,000-page book in front of the fire, it's a good read. And he makes the claim that essentially anti-Semitism is about othering. And that even in ancient Egypt, right, there were people who were using the term Jew to make a claim about somebody who is not like me, but is also connected with me, right? So there's kind of radical otherness, like I am this and that person is not me in any way, shape, or form, right? So anti-Black racism, for example, right, when claims are made about people of color being less than human, right? The ways that chattel slavery in America was justified by claiming that certain people are worth only a percentage of certain other people, right? The way that human beings were treated like animals, essentially. Anti-Semitism is a little more complex than that kind of a hatred, in that it has always been the sense of we're the insider outsiders. So people, are nervous about us because we're the ones who can often pass, not always, as to the conversation about Jews of color, for example, but oftentimes in history, we've been the ones who could pass. And so the danger that people feel when they lash out with anti-Semitic claims or anti-Semitic actions or policies is saying, these are people who are not really like us, but they are among us. You get that in the book of Esther, where Haman makes this claim about the Jewish people, right? This is a people they're not our people. Meanwhile, of course, the irony is that one of those people was currently married to the king, right? And they didn't know it. So that's often the claim. Throughout history, anti-Semitism has manifest. So, it was there when Jews were expelled from England in 1290. It was there certainly at the advent of the blood libel in 1144, I want to say it was the first one in England, in Norwich, England, but probably the blood libel existed earlier than that. That's the canard that says that Jews take Christian children, murder them, and take their blood and bake them into matzahs, into our unleavened bread for Pesach. And if you're horrified by that and think, why would anyone ever think such a thing? One only needs to look at the QAnon movement to see plenty of traces of the blood libel in that ideology today. Jews were kicked out of various countries over time. 1492, while Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, Jews were getting booted out of Spain and then from Portugal as well. And of course we know, without doing an entire history lesson here, that probably the most stunning and horrific example of anti-Semitism put into policy was the attempted eradication of the Jewish people from Europe and perhaps from the world by the Nazis during the Shoah, during the Holocaust, when they murdered 6 million of our people. So this is not a new thing. As Corey pointed out, it exists in America. And I'll just kind of end what I'm saying in this moment by sharing that the rates of anti-Semitism are on the rise. So there's a new ADL report that Maria can probably speak to. I think it was a 17% increase in anti-Semitic incidents this year, maybe somewhere around 140 or 150% increase in the last couple of years. So this is a trend that we're seeing, and those are just the more overt expressions of anti-Semitism. Of course, there are all the small indignities that so many of us have to deal with that are not quantified in survey data.
Thank you so much for that, Rabbi Burg. It makes me think about, you mentioned that all of this going on, even in the context of, like Columbus, and I think about colonialism and its impact on where we are in the world and sort of its ongoing insidiousness. And there is, I can put it in the chat. I was listening to a podcast recently with a question that I had never considered. The question was, is Judaism a religion? And Rabbi Jesse Paikin, who was the facilitator of this podcast, was talking about essentially the history of where Judaism once existed and was never understood by those who practiced it as a religion in the way we conceptualize it today, that it was it was communal, it was storytelling, it was part of an ethical framework and a lifestyle, and that this piece about spirituality would never have been separated out from that. And so it really talks about Judaism becoming a religion out of a need to fit into a colonialist framework of what religion is. And that was certainly a powerful learning for me just recently about, history and anti-Semitism and colonialism and how this all fits together. So that really resonates. I want to, first of all, I just want to name this piece and not gloss over the piece about the statistics on rising anti-Semitism. And I think rising hate in many realms, hate towards the LGBTQ community, hate towards the Black community, hate towards the Muslim community. There's a rise in hate crimes, including anti-Semitism. And just to really name that, and I think that is all the more reason that it's so important that we're coming together as a community to have conversations like this, and hopefully, not hopefully, to have, we need to have more conversations like this and have these conversations really visible in our community. I want to transition a little bit to a question that came up. We have not at this point talked a lot about Israel. And I'll name, certainly that I think Israel in particular is an aspect of Judaism and the Jewish community that brings up a lot of, there's just so many differing opinions and perspectives. But in talking through some of the questions we wanted to touch on today, the panelists talked a little bit about, I think, an important question that comes up, which is, what's the difference between anti-Semitism and political criticisms of Israel? And when might that line get crossed? And sort of with that, what does it look like to engage in meaningful dialogue, critical dialogue even, around Israel that doesn't perpetuate rising anti-Semitism? Maria?
I'm happy to take an initial sort of first step at this, and if others want to join in or argue or debate, certainly happy to help moderate that. This is a very complicated and nuanced issue, and certainly the state of Israel and its government can be legitimately criticized just like any other country or government in the world. And the criticism of particular Israeli actions or policies in and of itself does not constitute anti-Semitism. And one way to distinguish between criticism of Israel that is within the bounds of legitimate political discourse versus what crosses the line into anti-Semitism is to recognize when those that criticize Israel invoke some of the traditional anti-Jewish references, accusations, and conspiracy theories. So, for example, when Jews are depicted in imagery as having hooked noses or dark, ugly, kind of demonic figures, or when Israelis are accused of crimes that are reminiscent of age-old anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, like alleged Israeli or Jewish plans for world domination, that a Jewish cabal, which relates back to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, is behind Israel's strength or behind foreign policy that's favorable to Israel, or allegations of Israeli actions that are just very similar to medieval blood libels, right? Another common theme is when Israelis are compared to Nazis and Hitler. This comparison between the Jewish state and those who perpetrated the greatest and largest act of anti-Semitism in world history is not an impartial or a dispassionate accusation, right? It's a charge that's very purposely directed at Jews in an effort to associate the victims of the Nazi crimes with the Nazi aggressors, and serves to diminish the significance and the uniqueness, really, of the Holocaust. So to make such a comparison is an act of blatant hostility towards Jews and Jewish history. Right, and finally, some deeper bias against Israel and Jews can be really evident when Israel is held to a different standard than any other country in the world. Such an example might include when critics of Israel question or deny Israel's right to exist, right? No one else is questioning France's right to exist or Egypt's right to exist simply because there's disagreement with their policies. So it becomes really suspect then that only the Jewish state's legitimacy is a subject for discussion. And sort of similarly, questions of motivation arise when Israel is singled out for criticism for actions or policies that other nations around the world engage in with impunity.
Well said.
Yeah, Corey.
Yeah, so I can share that I have been bringing our own students actually to Israel. So I started a partnership with a colleague at the University of Haifa going on 10 years ago. And so since about 2013 was our first cohort, 4 times in person and once virtually last year, we have run a course that is called "What Does Social Justice Look Like in My Community?" And so it's always been supported by the school and generally, but I have found that and just maybe some example to what was said, that sometimes there's an assumption that because the class is going to Israel, that we won't have conversations like the kind of conversations that we would have in any other class at the School of Social Work, in the sense that there won't be differing viewpoints, that that the people who take the class won't be diverse in whatever axis of diversity might be imagined. Well, I have not gotten a lot on this. I have gotten in the past, there was one email that made an assumption about what our view would be on Israel or Israel's policies, or that we were going to be anti-Palestinian or anti-Muslim without asking me the question. So there was an assumption about what this course would be and what the content would be, and that it would somehow have a political stance. The course has always entertained a huge diversity of viewpoints, both on any matter, right? So we talk about health, we talk about US policy, we talk about policy in Israel, and also the assumption that Israel is a place where only Jews can live or only Jews have rights. And our class always had about 1/3 of the class were people who were not Jewish. So they were Christian and they were Muslim and they were Druze. And they were Jewish. And so the sort of assumptions about, that Israel is somehow monolithic, either in the composition of the people who live there, or in terms of the political views, or the kind of dialogue that would happen, I think is maybe a more subtle example that I often get, and I probably get because I have the class, and so it would be sort of a magnet for those kind of questions or assumptions. Again, it's not everybody, but that is what it might look like in a way that came from a place of innocence and lack of knowledge. I think most of what I had heard would not be malintentioned, but it would be an assumption that comes from that same place of sort of conflating from a place of anti-Zionism or conflating anti-Zionism or Israel with Jews, or Jews with Israel, both directions.
And I would just pipe in to say that I love Israel. I told you I'm a loud and proud Jew. And it feels sometimes very much like I need to park my love for Judaism in progressive spaces if I would like to belong. And that's too bad, because I have a lot to offer.
Thank you so much, everyone. I see a lot of important comments in the chat as well. Jessica.
Oh, I think everyone pretty much covered it. I would just add, I think that for me, I think when conversations are full of like generalizations rather than specific points, or when the focus is that a group of people should not exist, I think these are when, for me, I've seen it sort of veer away from having a conversation or a valid critique. There's lots to critique, and veering into trying to erase a group of people, or whether by like actually, a physical erasure, or even just by homogenizing and dismissing.
And the only thing I think I would add, if it's all right, is we haven't really touched so much on Christianity and its sort of impact on the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Christianity, of course, did not invent anti-Semitism, nor is Christianity as a faith tradition, an anti-Semitic faith tradition, of course. But it is important, I think, to name that the way the version of Christianity called Christian supersessionism, the replacement of the original covenant between God and the Jewish people, as some Christians understand it, by a new covenant which invalidates the old covenant, also affects the way that people view and treat Jews. Sometimes that's more explicit, like, going and doing a pogrom because you saw a passion play. But sometimes it's also related to the state of Israel. So there can be kind of a weird philo-Semitic inversion that happens, where people will say, well, you Jewish people are supposed to be a light unto the nations, right? You're supposed to be better. And we want to hold you to a different standard, right? You need to treat the Palestinians better than, North Koreans treat their people, or, Sudanese treat their people, or Assad in Syria, treated his, right? Because you're the Jewish people, right? And so that, like, can one claim that the Jewish people are better? No, even Jewish people should never claim that. And if they do, you should tell them they're wrong. That's not what chosenness is about. That's a mischaracterization, I think, of what chosenness is about. Can someone say that the Jewish people ought to be a light unto the nations and therefore hold themselves to a higher standard than what they see around the world? Sure, you can say that, but you have to be Jewish to say that, right? That's an okay internal conversation among Jews. That's not something that folks who are not Jewish can demand of us, right? Just as if, when I see Black leaders having internal conversations with African Americans about the standards to which they think their, families ought to be held in raising children, that's a legitimate conversation to have within the Black cultural community, but it's not something that white people ever get to say, right? So we have to be really, so I think there is that piece of that. And there's also a way that Christian supersessionism or accusations of deicide, for example, right? This notion that the Jews killed Jesus can even make their way into Middle Eastern politics, right? So it wasn't an accident that years ago, Assad was sitting with the Pope and essentially said to him something to the effect of, aren't you angry that these people killed your God? Right? So how does that happen? How does the protocols of the elders of Zion, something that was developed in Russia, make its way into a into a major kind of, now we call it a limited television series, but a mini series in Egypt, which was wildly popular in Egypt, right? And that's the way that also that version of anti-Semitism devolves around conversations around Israel.
And this is so important. Rabbi Burg, thank you so much for bringing up the piece about Christianity, and I would say Christian supremacy, because I don't think we've touched on that yet until this point in the conversation. And this is such an important conversation, and there are a few other pieces that I want to make sure we touch on before we open it up to Q&A. And I think this conversation, Sean, I saw you in the chat, your comment about white American Christian culture really ties nicely into this next piece, which is talking a little bit about just the layers of oppression that exist in our communities, and how anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness and even things like anti-Muslim sentiments, how that all intersects with other forms of prejudice and oppression.
I can start.
Well,
oh, unless you was sorry.
You got that, Jessica. Go.
No, I'll keep it brief. I just was going to say that I think that oppression is a tool to divide the oppressed. And I think oppression comes in many forms, and anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness are two forms. And I think the reason both are so insidious is because the people who are in power use them to blame and to harm the people that they are oppressing, and then convince the people who are oppressed that the other oppressed people around them are the enemy. But yeah, so that's just how I think, it goes back to our oppressions are tied. If you want to help, then like go away. If you want to like take up arms with me, then let's do it.
So in my personal opinion, I really do believe that is in how we got introduced to each other. When you think about America as a culture, it's the white Christian nation, right? And the division, Black people were the color line, right? So like if you have Black proximity, you're probably not gonna experience the best of that America has to offer. If you have white proximity, then you're gonna experience what the joys of being American. As Jewish people are immigrating to America though, right? There's this idea, even though you believe in teshuvah and you believe in repair and you believe in trying to help those that are less fortunate, right? When you come here, it is different. We don't help those folks, right? And that is the way that it was introduced, right? So then imagine that these white Christian people are bringing Jews into these communities of Black folks, right, that are destitute, and they are giving them property and things like that. They're allowing them to be stewards of the land, but then they're telling the Black people like, hey, look at these greedy people that are taking everything from you, right? It's the Christian lens that's applied, so it makes Black people go, well, dang, they really did just come into our community and kind of take everything, right? So it's the framing. And then we have to also understand that America is really just a very racist nation, right? Like the reason why the Holocaust had such an impact globally, right, is because Adolf Hitler used a recipe that America used for American chattel slavery, right? And then used it and tried to eradicate a group of people off the planet. So people don't understand the world implications. Had it happened, right, then everybody uses this model to exterminate all the brutes, which is what Manifest Destiny was teaching the world. So, I mean, we can get into the larger portion of the religious portion of that debate, but we have to understand the responsibility of Christianity in America as we are speaking about anti-Semitism from an American lens.
Thank you, Sean. Yes, 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 yes. Any other reactions?
I'll add on if, oh, Corey, go. It's still muted, don't know how to work anything. Yeah, I would just add on, I think the lens that Sean is pointing out, the American lens, is also really important because there is this idea of becoming white in America, and how certain groups who faced discrimination when they first came were able to become white and sort of acquire white privilege. And like, for example, what our modern like IQ test is based on is discriminatory tests used at Ellis Island to discriminate against Jewish people coming in and other people coming in who didn't speak the language that the test was in. So I think that with Jewish people, there's a lot of conversation around whiteness, not whiteness, and this idea of how education was a tool in which at least Ashkenazi Jews in the United States became white versus Irish Americans who really utilize minstrel shows as well as, not exclusively, but that just was one way, that sort of idea of dividing groups against each other so that they blamed each other for issues, or they said, well, at least I'm not as bad as this group. So I think that it's really important to have that lens of American history when considering how anti-Semitism and like anti-Blackness and sort of oppression in general developed and sort of continues to weave itself into American history.
I was just going to add, and Rabbi Burg probably will know more about this than I do, but this touches a little bit on what I meant when I was thinking about the idea of sort of precarity and as well as, you know, finding connection. You know, so there are, Judaism has this like weird thing where we're actually supposed to conflate time, right? So in the Passover Seder, we're supposed to think of ourselves as if we were slaves in Egypt, even though I'm sitting in my house in Ardmore, Pennsylvania, right? So I am supposed to put myself as if I am there, not as if like really be there. You know, on Hanukkah, when we're like, okay, we have this thing of Bayamim Ha'em B'Zman Hazeh, which is a weird conflation of time too. It's like in that time, at this time, like what is time? And so there is a strain of Judaism that asks us not to separate ourselves from our own past oppression. And we also have exhortations that we should be kind to the stranger. We should be kind to other people when we're not in that situation because we ourselves were strangers. So we are actually in our own sort of liturgy and our own, ethics, really supposed to think of both our own past and other people that might be suffering. And we are supposed to make those connections and act in the world in such a way that honors that towards other people, towards ourselves. And so that for me is always a little bit of a conundrum, right? So I'm supposed to think of myself there, which is part of the precarity and the fear and things that happen to, my family or my grandfather's family or my husband's father was on the kinder transport. Like, these are very real. On the other hand, I am, like I said, very protected. But I also think in conversations, for example, at the School of Social Work, I have a lot of privilege. So how do I sit with this idea of identification and wanting to do well, but also wanting to recognize that as a white person, as a white presenting person, and many other aspects, as a professor, right? I have a lot of privilege. So when is it appropriate for me to when and how is it appropriate for me to situate myself in that conversation? And so I think when I'm thinking about how does anti-Semitism show up with anti-Blackness and other forms of discrimination, I think about that a lot. And what is appropriate, and how does, just leave it at that. These are just thoughts that I have very often.
I think that's fascinating, and I would add that there are also ways in which those values that Corey is highlighting, the fact that 36 times we're told in Torah again and again, remember the stranger, the widow, the orphan, right? You were strangers in a strange land, so therefore you need to be sensitive and empathic to those who are on the margins, right? That has sort of made it into the, I hesitate to use the term DNA, but into the sort of cultural DNA of the Jewish people, right? It animates our way of walking in the world in the best of circumstances. Stephen Miller aside, right? So there are ways in which those tendencies in our people, right, to tell the story of oppression as if we are currently experiencing it, knowing that anti-Semitism is real and we're experiencing it in that way, but no, like, I've had Black folks at my house for Seder, and one of the most fascinating conversations, and I think a really important conversation, is to say, look, we say we were slaves in Egypt, but we also got to leave the taskmasters behind, right? We didn't have to make a life in the very place that enslaved us. And that's different for African Americans who are still here living with the descendants of those who enslaved them. So, but at the same time, it's not an accident that Jews are involved in various progressive causes in disproportionate numbers. I'll be taking a delegation from Beth to DC to protest in favor of reproductive rights in a couple of weeks. There are, Jews were involved in disproportionate numbers in the Free Darfur movement. There are just these things, right? And it's no accident, and this is kind of my point about anti-Semitism, that the person who murdered 11 Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh did so in part because that was a congregation that was involved in work to support refugee and immigrant communities. So you think about the intersection of Islamophobia or Asian hate or anti-Black racism or advocacy for immigrant and refugee populations, at least some, a certain subset of Jew haters hate us not just because we're, awful in our own right, but because we support all kinds of other things that they think are awful, including uplifting those who as Americans deserve our support because their story is our story, because so many of us, those of us brought to America in slave ships notwithstanding, but folks who look like me, my grandfather fled Nazi Germany after Kristallnacht in 1938. And I am here because he was able to come to America as a refugee.
Yeah, as so many of us are. Yeah, Judith.
I was just going to say that I'm really grateful my grandparents came in the late 1800s when we didn't have restrictive immigration laws. Because as most people probably know, by the 1940s, when Jews needed to flee, we weren't allowed into America. And the wonderful President Roosevelt restricted us to a sort of a prison camp in upstate New York. But there were, SS St. Louis was turned away. And the same things that they said about Jews, surprise, surprise, they're now saying about other immigrants, that we were going to steal jobs and we're dirty and we're bringing sickness. So the fear of the stranger never ends. But I'm so grateful my grandparents were able to come here before people hated immigrants.
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing script in the American history, right? Sean, to your point about kind of white Christian American culture. And I see several comments in the chat, and I'm feeling it too. And we're at a moment where we need to transition, but I want to stop and acknowledge that this is a lot. This conversation is a lot. It's deep. It's heavy. And just to, first of all, say thank you to all of our panelists for being so in this, and to all of you who are here with us in this dialogue, because this has been such an engaged group. And just for a moment, I have one more question that I want everyone to consider, and we'll open it up. But before we do that, I'd like to give everyone just a moment, take a deep breath, just take a moment of space. Yeah, Sean, that's where I am. Take a moment of space. All right. And so we're at the point now, time-wise, where we wanted to move into Q&A. And there was one last question that we were talking about. And what I'd like to do is just kind of put it out there for all of you as something that we can think about and maybe even integrate into the Q&A, because I'm also curious about what all of you are thinking as you're here with us. But the question is, this has been a short, and each of these topics we could, talk about for weeks, but such an important conversation. And now what? As social workers, what can we do to better support the Jewish community, to be better allies or better champions in dismantling anti-Semitism? So that's what I'd like us all to think about. Certainly if the panelists have any comments, and we'll open it up for questions and comments as well.
So I do want to make a comment. And this is a little bit of a heavy comment, but I live in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. And one of my neighbors, who is a social worker, and I had a long chat one day about Maryland School of Social Work, and he was absolutely emphatic that he would not be welcome at the School of Social Work because of his religious beliefs. And, we had a bit of a back and forth about it, but that was very thought-provoking. And I haven't yet resolved, we need to encourage diversity of thought and beliefs and religions, but it sort of weighed heavily on me that one of my fellow Jews would not be welcome at the School of Social Work because of his religious beliefs.
Thank you for sharing that, Judith. Yeah, so I'll open that up. Oh yeah, Sean.
I would say I learned a lot from the United States military. I was in the Army for a lot of years and I retired in 2014. But what I learned was exposure, right? It's exposure to identity, right? You have to have conversations, even though they may be tough sometimes. Like, you got to get to the root of why people think how they think. And if you don't ever try, then you don't try to get to the root of how people think, how can we really, as a community of people, say that we are trying to be better as people, right? That's the part. It's in the exposure. And if you never ever get the exposure, you will never ever know how to proceed.
I want to share something. I'm looking at Joan Zlotnick. Hi, Joan. Because this is I'm thinking a lot about a conversation that you and I had So before the pandemic, at the last, I think it was SWER, there was a panel on anti-Semitism in social work. And I remember talking to Joan about how, like, I've been at the school for many years. I've been here for 16 years and I've been in the profession for a long time, and it's something that we don't talk about. And on that panel, I was hesitating whether they use like haunted, but I feel like I'm sort of haunted by, one particular member of the panel was, and I don't remember his name, maybe Joan will remember, he was a professor, was a professor at University of Pittsburgh. And he talked about how he, was very engaged in work around diversity and anti-oppression at his school, but had never been engaged with this work around anti-Semitism for all sorts of reasons, probably a lot of which came up in conversation today. And he was speaking not that long after the murders at Society Hill Synagogue, and he was sharing with us his own sense of why had he never done that, what was making it so that he himself was either stopping himself or, and I, to some extent, I'm sort of haunted by that vision. Like, what does that vision look like that he was not able to? And I thought to myself, well, I mean, I talk about this a little, but not a lot, and not like I ever have in this forum here. And so I remember, like, seeing Joan, and I knew Joan, and having to so we had this conversation about it. And was sharing some of those feelings. So I just really want to say thank you, because I actually think that this conversation, it means we are talking about it clearly. And I feel very safe here, and this is Zoom, and I know some of you, and I don't know all of you, but this was put together by, Julia from the ODI, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and how valuable this work is, and that you have invited us to have this panel, and Jennifer Kelman, who was on here before, she's here, putting together this panel. And so I actually see this as part of my hope that we're able to share this, and reading all these comments in the chat. So agreeing with Sean that we have to talk about this, right? We have to reach out to each other. We have to be sensitive to, what we're saying and where we're talking. And we have to also be open to when people criticize us and challenge us. But, I'm feeling like this panel is, part of our answer too, so.
And I'm delighted, after not hearing anti-Semitism mentioned at the School of Social Work for the last 30 years. When we open space to talk about it, I find that people have so many questions about what it's like to be Jewish, and what does it mean, and why do you love Israel? And I never got that chance at the School of Social Work because I needed to be just white. So yes, I think offering space, and I know they opened an affinity space for Jews recently. I did wonder 3 years ago, which space was I supposed to go in? So I think we are making progress, and I really appreciate having the opportunity to participate.
Since my name was mentioned, let me just share a few things, because there have been some conversations going on in the session that Corey mentioned at SWER about Jews in social work education and their experiences. And there's also, through NASW, New York State chapter has been convening a group, and Carol Cox has done some research around Jews in social work. And I think that the School of Social Work has kind of this mixed history, with the combination of having had sort of a longstanding joint master's in social work and Jewish studies, as well as, I remember there was a candidate for dean at one point, I believe in the early 90s, and people said, oh, well, he wasn't going to get hired because he was thought to be Jewish, although he actually wasn't Jewish, because the previous dean that was hired, was Jewish, and there was this sense of anti-Semitism. And also, going back to Dan Thursz, when I worked at NASW, since Dan is dead and so is the other person related, I'll share this story in this group. Dan, who at the time, of course, was an expert in aging, so I got invited to this lunch with Dan and the new executive director at NASW. And Dan said he was shocked that someone who was Jewish had been hired as the executive director of NASW, because there had been this history sort of in the 80s around some of these issues that we were talking about related to Israel and anti-Semitism and Zionism, and equating Palestinian with Blacks and statements that social workers had taken on. And so I think there's a very conflicted place because you have so many Jewish social workers and you have this kind of history of very quiet anti-Semitism in social work that no one's really allowed to talk about, and people are only beginning to talk about it now.
Yeah, and I think going back to that white Christian culture, if we look at the roots of social work and how we started as a profession, that makes sense, right? It's embedded in our history, it's embedded in who we are as a profession. And I just want to name, I see several stories from students in the chat talking about ways in which they have not felt comfortable or been actively discouraged or even harmed by sharing their Jewishness and their Jewish identity here at the school and in your classes. And, I want to elevate Nejma's comment in the chat that ODEI, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, is committed to getting this right. And as a professor at the school, I want to give to you my commitment as well, that we've got to do better, that this isn't this isn't who we are, and this isn't what we stand for as social workers. And you certainly have my commitment that we'll work together to make sure that that's not your reality and not the reality for other students. I know we're very short on time, but I do want to open up space for a few minutes. Other questions or other comments? Got about 5 minutes.
I guess the only two things that I wanted to share, and I'm a graduating MSW student in 2 weeks, knock on wood, is, thank you. One of the experiences that I had, and this is very odd. So I am formally Orthodox. I don't identify that way anymore because as an LGBTQ+ person and individual with disability that's also Jewish, I did not feel comfortable in my Orthodox community. I spent way too many years of my life being told I was going to burn in hell for all of my sins and that I didn't belong. And I recognize that that's not the case for all the communities, and there are amazing religious Jewish communities. So my experience is not everybody's, but just for me, a lot of religious communities are associated with trauma involving oppressive identities. So I use my identities now as a segue to help other Jews from other backgrounds. It's okay if you're gay. It's okay if you have a disability. If that community doesn't like you, here's 3 others that I can find that probably will. And just, I work for Moishe House, Baltimore, so my job is to help young adults navigate Judaism in their own way throughout the city. But the comment that I was going to say is, I observe Rosh Hashanah and some of the Jewish holidays with my family, and I tell all of my employers and jobs weeks ahead. They know. Most of them don't care. As long as I make up my work, cool. Have a happy holiday. I'm happy to explain it to you. Last year with the field office, I took off for Jewish holidays. Nobody cared. I made up the hours. Cool. This year, Rosh Hashanah was the first day of field. So the first thing I had to email was my clinical supervisor saying that, hey, I'm not going to be there. My clinical supervisor, my agency, was people of color, Jews, everybody. Nobody cared. I just made up the work. The school's field office said, hey, Dana, in order to not start on Rosh Hashanah, you need to have an appeal letter explaining why you want to do this and justifying the holiday. And I'm like, Rosh Hashanah has been existing for 80+ years. I didn't have to do this last year. Why do I have to write a letter of appeal to the dean of the field office explaining why Rosh Hashanah is real and why I need time off? If this were any other religious holiday, like if that people knew more about, I don't think they would care. And I have a rabbi on call who's one of my life mentors. I'm just like, Jeremy, get ready to write a 2-page letter about Rosh Hashanah, because sometimes they don't believe the holidays are real and that they think I'm lying or making it up, even though I'd argue Jewish New Year is one of the most important ones. So I talked to the field office about this 5 months after it happened, and I got a formal apology, which was really nice, which was for all of the Jewish people. You should not have to write a personal appeal letter explaining why your holiday is valid and why you need to take time off. As long as your supervisor's cool with it, which mine was, really shouldn't matter. So I think that's a procedural thing the field office needs to work on, where in the future, we should not interrogate people about their religious holidays. I would have been so much happier to just have an interview or one-on-one meeting explaining what the Jewish holiday was, but having to write a personal letter about why I need to take off seemed a little bit anti-Semitic in a way, because you wouldn't ask other people. And then the only other thing that I wanted to share, and this is a little bit trickier, but the 610 course is the new structural oppression course, which is amazing. And we talk about religion and we talk about identities, but I don't feel like Jews necessarily in the religion section have their own space or freedom because we're also white. So when I took 610 and it was the religious course, we talked about Christianity, Islam, we talked about a lot of different cultural religions and the oppression. But I know that I literally wrote a 7-page paper about my white privilege and my Jewish oppressions. And my professor and half of my class was blown away. I think it wasn't a negative thing. It's just, I think they assumed that me being white and Jewish came with so much privilege, and they were shocked that there was oppressions, and there wasn't really time to delve into it because we were focusing on so many religions as a whole that I feel like Jews and Muslims, who needed the conversation the most, didn't have the space for it. So I guess for the 610 curriculum, I recognize you can't pinpoint certain religions because that would cause problems. But I do think that for Jews and Muslims, it's more than just a religion. It's a culture. It's a way of life. They have been through so much oppression. And if they can't do it in a class of 30 people in 610, there should at least be affinity spaces, role models, or somewhere they can go, because it doesn't always happen on purpose. These two were really passive examples. And the reason it doesn't bother me is because I'm very openly Jewish, and people that don't care have a great life. Like, you're not my problem. But I recognize that not everybody has that personality, and some people really do get upset by it. So the affinity spaces is a good start, but just having readings or syllabi in the curriculum and having ways to incorporate it in a respectful way. Just because, Dana, you're Jewish, but you're not Orthodox. I'm like, that's correct. I would love to give you the synopsis on there's 40 plus versions of Christianity. There's like 20 plus versions of Judaism. I don't have hate for anybody that's religious. Go you. That's just not my way of life. So I want to let other people talk, but I just wanted to share the passive ways that we could kind of be more inclusive as a whole in the school.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dana. And, you know, I think what really resonates too is that in social work, it's so important that we are, number one, aware, and number two, opening up space and asking people, what are your cultural practices? What are your religious observances? What dates do we need to be aware of? You know, let us know where we're missing the mark. And I think that we are clearly not doing that well enough. And so thank you so much to everyone here who has been willing to share today. Again, I know that there is so much more that we could talk about, and we will. More conversations to come. With that, in the last few minutes, I want to give a little space to wrap up. Brian, I know you had mentioned there was something you wanted to share, and then I'll hand it over to Julia.
Oh no, I'll just share in the chat. I think I already shared it. Just another series, ongoing conversation. This is beautiful, amazing. Love you, Dana. And just enjoy the conversation continuing. So I'll share in the chat. There's a whole 3 or 4 other series that you can go to.
All right. Wow. That was a lot of information. That was a lot of things to think through. I want to thank our panelists for sharing their wisdom, their experiences. I want to thank our audience for coming and, you know, listening, as well as putting a lot of information in the chat. There was like so much information in the chat. So I'm hoping that in our post kind of email, I'll make sure that I get some of the things that were mentioned and putting that in our resources. Speaking of resources, I want to make sure that I share really quickly. You're going to get this in an email, as well as I'm going to put it in the chat in a couple minutes. But these are some of the resources that our panelists actually gathered for us for this discussion today. And so you will be getting that information as we wrap up and in our emails, as I mentioned. And I want to make sure that you all put it in the chat, a survey, so we can continue to have events like these. As our office has mentioned, we are dedicated to making sure that the School of Social Work is a safe space for everyone who comes through its doors. And the work of social work is about being inclusive, is about going into community and making folks feel welcome as well as helping. And we can only do that if we continue to educate ourselves. And so events like these are very important to continue these important conversations. So in that regard, I want to make sure that you all can, if you put up your phone to the QR code, you can do the survey. But the survey link should also be in the chat and will also be emailed to everyone who registered for this event. Once again, I want to thank everyone on our panel as well for coming in on this lovely rainy Friday and speaking about a topic that is very difficult, that is varied, that has brings up a lot of emotions for people. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without you all. So thank you all once again. If there are any other questions or comments, please let us know, but we look forward to having more events like these and continuing conversations like these going forward. So thank you for coming and joining us for this event.
Thank y'all so much. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom,
shalom.
everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
I felt so smart being next to y'all. Woo.
Oh.